shame, when a whole town decides to pour it on you at once, does not feel like a word or a look. It feels like cold water flung in the face and old rope burning the wrists. And the woman they marched up the middle of the camp that gray morning felt both and understood, under the roar of it, that this was only the polite shape of a killing. They had not used a gun, because a gun leaves a hole a circuit judge can measure. They used a verdict instead, read by a man in a good coat, 100 faces that would not meet her eyes, and a long white trail going up into the teeth of the first winter storm. Hands shoved her from behind. A voice she had once trusted, smooth and reasonable and pitched to carry, told the crowd that the high country judged its own, and that an honest camp could not keep a thief and a slanderer under its roof. And as they drove her toward the burning footbridge at the edge of the world, a low voice somewhere off in the falling snow, where the trap lines ran and no townsman ever went, said one flat thing into the cold, and it was not to her. That's no thief. That's a woman they've sentenced to a winter. And then the bridge timbers caught, and the rope of faces closed behind her, and they left her on the wrong side of the fire, with the whole mountain for a cell. Rewind, 8 days before a camp decided the cleanest way to bury an inconvenient truth was to let a mountain freeze it. The woman who would owe a silent stranger her whole life, and despise herself for needing to stood at a brick-a-say furnace in a one-room office at the edge of a silver camp, weighing a button of gold, no bigger than a lentil on a balance so fine it tipped at her own breath. Her name was Della Forsythe. Dell to the two people who had ever said it soft, and both of them now under the frozen ground. And she was nobody in that camp, a young widow with a trade that lived on other men's hopes and other men's ore. She had grown up in a smelter town where her father ran a small assay office and her mother kept the books beside him, and she had learned to cup a sample and read a bead of metal before she could read a primer, to know good rock from salted by the smell of the flux and the color of the slag. She had married a careful, quiet man off her father's own bench, Tom Forsythe, with a weak heart he made light of and a notion of his own office in the new silver country. They had come west on an assayer's promise in a crate of crucibles freighted up in straw, hung out a shingle in a raw camp called Quartzfall, and for 2 years told men for a fee, the one true thing nobody up there wanted to hear without paying for it, what their rock was actually worth. The weak heart did not make light of itself. It stopped him in the autumn between one breath and the next, over the balance she stood at now. And an assay office is a thing you cannot eat. So when the camp's affairs went on without her, Della kept the office open, because it was the only roof and the only trade she had. And there was nothing behind her but a dead man's crucibles and a debt on the freight that had hauled them up. She did the assays the men brought her and wrote out their certificates in her small, exact hand, and the camp took her work because it was honest, and there was no one else inside of 40 mountain miles who could do it. She did not know, raking the coals from under a crucible with her mother's brass assay weight on a thong at her throat, that she had already been marked, that she had not kept the one safe corner of a hard country, but the exact pair of eyes a swindler would one day need to put out. The camp called Quartzfall was less a town than a wound the diggings had torn in the mountainside, a single rutted street of false front saloons and a mercantile, and a claims office strung along a creek the color of weak tea. And above it the timber thinned and gave way to rock and snow, and the long pass that went over the top toward the district seat, 2 days east. It lived and died on what came out of the ground, and what came out was middling at best, a thin silver that paid a wage and never a fortune, and that one hard fact was the engine of everything after. Because a camp that is only ever middling is a camp where a clever man can sell the dream of better. Della cooked over the assay coals and hauled her water from the tea-colored creek and slept on a cot behind the office partition, and minded the one thing every soul in that camp wanted out of her: the truth about their rock, written and signed and stamped with the little steel die that made it law in a buyer's eyes. And the certificates she signed were the realest thing in Quartzfall, because a man could lie about his claim all he liked over a glass in the saloon, but he could not lie to her furnace. The man who ran the swindle, and the camp along with it, was named Doran Skeel, and he was the law of Quartzfall, the way the company store is the law of a wage, completely and without ever raising his voice. He was the claims recorder and head of the camp's vigilance committee, both. A lean, dry, pleasant man of about 48 in a good dark broadcloth coat, the only good coat in camp, come up 2 years back with Eastern money behind him, and a gift for making poor men feel like partners in a thing about to turn rich. He recorded the claims and he sold the claims, and of late he had been selling them east to investors in far cities who would never climb a mountain to look, papering them with assay certificates that swore the rock ran fabulously rich, and the rock did not run rich, and Skeel knew it, because Skeel was salting it, seeding barren samples with filed gold, and a charge of dust fired in from a shotgun. The oldest and ugliest fraud in the mining country, and the one thing standing between his salted samples and the Eastern banknotes, was a true assay out of an honest office. That is, a young widow with a brick furnace and a fine balance, and a maddening refusal to weigh a thing as anything other than exactly what it was. It came to a head over a single sample of ore the second week of the deep autumn, the way these things do. Quiet, and then all at once. A nervous clerk Skeel kept brought her a packet of crushed rock and a printed form half filled out, and asked her, not meeting her eye, to assay it and sign that it ran better than 200 ounces of silver and a fine showing of gold to the ton, which would have made it one of the richest strikes in the territory. Della ran it as she ran everything, with no thumb on the scale, and the rock came back middling silver and almost no gold, a perfectly ordinary piece of Quartzfall's thin country. But she had spent her life around salted samples, and as she cupped it, she saw what her trade had trained her to see, that the gold was wrong, sitting up on the surface in bright filed flakes that had never grown in that rock, that some hand had married barren stone to gold dust on purpose. She did not sign the form. She wrote out instead the true assay, the honest middling numbers, and on the back set down, in her small exact hand, plainly, that the sample showed clear sign of having been salted with introduced gold, and gave the clerk the truth and kept a fair copy for the office book, the way her father had taught her to copy every certificate she signed, because an assayer's book is her honor written down. She had no idea, sliding that copy into the ledger, that she had just signed the order for her own death, and that it would come not with a rope and not with a gun, but with a vote. Doran Skeel did not come to shout at her. That was not his way, and it was the first thing about him that truly frightened her once she understood it. He came to the office 2 days later, pleasant as ever, turning his hat in his hands, and told her there had plainly been some mistake with the sample, and asked her, reasonably man to woman, in a hard country to sign a corrected certificate with the richer numbers, and named without calling it a bribe, a figure that would have cleared her dead husband's freight debt twice over, and bought her passage anywhere she cared to go. And Della Forsythe, who had spent her whole life believing that everything she owned could be taken from her by a man with more power, looked at the one thing she owned that no man could take, which was a true number, and said no. She told him she would not sign a thing her furnace had not proved, that her name on a certificate meant the rock was what she said, and nothing else, and that if there had truly been a mistake he could bring her a fresh sample, and she would assay it true and free. And she watched the pleasantness go out of his eyes like a lamp turned down, before he smiled and put his hat back on, and said he was sorry she felt that way, and that a camp was a delicate thing, and a person ought to be careful, up here, about being the only one out of step. And he went, and Della stood at her cold furnace and felt, for the first time, the mountain at her back like a door easing shut. What he did was older and cleverer than a bribe, and far worse. Because Doran Skeel understood that you do not silence an honest assayer by buying her. You silence her by making her word worthless. And then you make her gone. Inside of a week the talk had started, the way talk starts in a camp, from no mouth you could point to. That the widow at the assay office had been caught salting samples herself to extort the men who brought her ore. That she had office gold gone missing that was not rightly hers. That a woman alone running an assay bench was a temptation to fraud an honest camp could not afford, and that her certificates, all of them, going back the full 2 years, could no longer be trusted, which conveniently poisoned the one true assay she had signed along with every paper she had ever stamped. It was beautiful in its ugly way, and Della could do nothing against it, because a poor widow's bare word that she is honest is the lightest thing in the world, weightless against a rich man's whisper. And the more plainly she told the truth, the more it sounded like a guilty woman protesting her guilt. And then Doran Skeel, who held the camp's law in one hand and its vigilance committee in the other, simply called a court. Not a real one. The nearest real one lay 2 days' hard ride over the pass to the east, and the pass was about to close. He convened the vigilance committee instead, the dozen propertied men of the camp, in the back room of the largest saloon, on a charge sworn against Della Forsyth for salting ore to defraud and stealing assay office gold. And he sat, as the head of it, judge of the very fraud he had committed, and the verdict was never in doubt. They would not hang her, he told the committee reasonably. The camp was not savage, and the hanging of a woman would bring down on them exactly the territorial law an honest camp had no need of. They would do the merciful thing instead. They would put her out, strip her of her thieving certificates and her ill-got trade, and drum her out over the high trail, and let her make her own way down the far side if the mountain was willing. And if it was not willing, well, that was the mountain's verdict, and no man's hand was in it. If you have ever stood in a room full of people you fed and weighed fair dealing for, and watched every last one of them decide, at the same moment, that it was easier to believe a comfortable lie than to stand next to your dangerous truth, then you already know the particular cold that came into Della Forsyth that morning, and you know it is a colder thing than any mountain. Stay up here with me a while, because that is the exact country this whole channel was built to walk. The steep frozen distance between the death a hard world quietly arranges for the inconvenient, and the life they would have to climb to reach instead. And the way the toughest, most thrown-away souls on God's earth sometimes find each other in the very place they were each sent to disappear. Subscribe and keep the notifications on, because the lamp is always burning up here at Timberline Hearts. And there is another soul clawing out of the cold every single week. They came for her at first light, before the storm building over the peaks could break, because Doran Skeel wanted the timing to look like nothing more than bad luck with the weather. They did not let her pack. 2 committee men with their hat brims pulled low marched her out of the office she had kept honest for 2 years, and a third took up the office ledger, the book with her honest copy of the salted assay in it, as if to carry it off as evidence. And Della understood even then that the book would feed a stove the instant she was out of sight, that they were burning the only proof and calling it a court exhibit. She had one thing on her they did not think to take, because it looked like nothing, the small worn brass assay weight on its leather thong at her throat, her mother's, the one tool she had carried out of every place she had ever lost. They gave her the clothes she stood up in, her thin gray wool dress and a worn shawl, and her good town boots, and they walked her up the middle of Quartzfall in the gray dawn, while the whole camp lined the rutted street to watch the thief be drummed out. And not one of them, not a single soul, met her eyes. And at the edge of the camp, where the high trail crossed the gorge of the tea-colored creek on a footbridge of peeled logs, Doran Skeel performed the last and cleverest cruelty of the whole design, the one that turned a banishment into a murder with no hand laid on it. He had the bridge fired behind her. He stood on the campsite in his good coat and told the crowd, in his reasonable carrying voice, that the committee would not have it said they had not given her a road. The trail lay open, up and over the pass to the district seat, 2 days east, and what she made of it was between her and her maker. And then his men touched off the pitch-soaked timbers, so that there was no road back, only the road up, into the rock and the snow and the storm, now blackening the eastern sky. And Della Forsythe stood on the wrong side of a burning bridge at the foot of a closing pass with no food, no blanket, no coat worth the name, and a verdict no court she could reach in time had heard and understood exactly what was being done to her and how clean it would look when the thaw turned up her bones. Because that was the genius of it, and the horror. Doran Skeel never had to lay a hand on her. He had only to run a slanderer out over the trail with a lawful vote and let the mountain do the killing, so the thaw would turn up a foolish woman who had not had the strength to make it down. No wound, no powder, no mark on his good dark coat. And Della felt the old cold of the courtroom the poor always know, the cold of a world that arranges your ruin so the arranging itself looks like mercy and like law, and turned her back on the camp and started up the trail, because she would rather die climbing than die standing still where they could watch. She climbed longer than Doran Skeel had reckoned, because he had measured the camp and the weather and the trail, but not Della Forsythe. She got above the timber before the storm broke, and when it broke as the first big storm of winter does, all at once and with no mercy in it, the snow not falling but driving sideways into her face hard as flung gravel, the trail vanishing switchback by switchback until there was no trail, only a white roar and the looming dark shapes of rocks. She wrapped the shawl over her head and pushed into it, because to stop was to die, and pushed for hours, the cold getting past the thin wool and into the meat of her, her hands going from pain to a worse thing than pain, her thoughts coming slow and warm and dangerous the way they come at the end. And somewhere in the white, when she could no longer feel her feet or tell up the trail from down, she put her cracked hand to the small brass weight at her throat, the one true thing they had not been able to take, and held it and kept climbing toward a pass she could no longer see, because her father had taught her that you finish the assay even when the bead is bad, that you do not quit the fire halfway, and she was not going to lie down in the snow and prove Doran Skeel right about her. She did not reach the top. The drifts went past her knees and then her waist, and the cold took the strength out of her by the yard, and on the high open shoulder of the pass she went down in a drift and could not rise. And the snow began, almost gently, to draw a blanket over her, and she thought, with the strange, clear calm that comes at the end of the cold, of her mother's hands moving sure over the balance and the small, bright tick of the beam coming to rest, and she closed her eyes. And that should have been all of it, the clean, quiet execution Skeel had ordered up out of the mountain. Except that there was, that year, one soul who walked the high country in the worst of a winter storm and feared nothing the cold could do. And he was, by the grace of whatever still watches over the thrown away, running a high line of marten traps along that very shoulder of the pass when the storm drove him toward his cabin, and he cut a track where there should have been none, a single floundering trail wandering up off a dead trail into the open white, and followed it down into the teeth of the wind to adrift with a hand stuck out of it, in a small brass weight on a thong catching the last gray light. His name was Silas Renner, and he had not gone looking for her, nor for anyone alive, because Silas Renner had spent 11 winters making certain there was no longer a soul left in the world to come looking for. A fur trapper, a big, slow-moving man of about 38, built long and heavy through the shoulders, weather-browned, long, dark hair hacked off short with a knife, a heavy, dark beard, a healed knife scar splitting his left brow, and a nose broken more than once, and set crooked. And over all of it the silence of a man who has had no call for words in nearly a decade. He had come west out of the war, out of Shiloh, and the hard year after it, and things he did not name even to himself, and gone up into the high bitterroot country the way a gut-shot animal goes to ground, and let the world below forget such a man had ever drawn breath. He saw the hand in the drift and didn't stop to wonder how it came to be there. He dug her out with his bare hands and got her up across his shoulders, a slight half-frozen weight that just barely still pulled a breath, and turned off the killing shoulder of the pass and carried her down his own hard mile to the one warm thing in that screaming white, a low cabin under a cliff with a stove banked and breathing in the dark. And that carry, that stubborn animal refusal to let the cold have one more body it had no right to, was the beginning of the end of two people's long arrangement to die alone. She came back to herself slowly and from a great depth, in a dim room gone gold at one end where a fire burned low, wrapped to the chin in blankets and furs that smelled of pine and wood smoke, and another living person with a deep, all-over ache that told her, before her mind worked, that she had not, against every odd, lost any part of herself to the frost. The last thing she had known was the drift and the dark and the small, bright tick of the remembered balance, and now there was heat, and the weight of furs, and the sense of some great, still presence in the room, and the old reflex of a cornered woman came up through the fog, the certainty her whole life had drummed into her, that every warmth is the front half of a bill. She got an elbow under herself, and a low voice came out of the dimness, not unkind, flat as a man stating a fact about the weather. Lie still. You've been 2 days thawing and you near lost 3 toes. You didn't. Let 'em hurt. And she lay still because she had no strength to do otherwise, and watched the dark shape across the room resolve into a mountain of a man feeding a stove with his broad back half to her, and waited, her heart going hard, for the moment the terms would be named. They were not named. He brought her broth boiled thin so it would sit easy on a starved stomach, and did not hand it to her, but set it on a round of log within reach, so a person too weak to take it would not have to ask, and said only, "Drink that when you can, slow." When she found her voice, it came cracked and full of suspicion, and the first thing out of it was the question that had governed her whole life, where she was and what he wanted of her. "You're up under the cliff, 2 drainages north of the pass trail. I trapped these draws. I found you walking off a dead trail into open snow, which is a thing only the lost and the cast out ever do." He fed another stick to the fire. "Renner, if you need a thing to call me, Silas Renner. I don't want anything off you. You can quit hunting for the price. There isn't one." And Della Forsythe, who had spent her entire life certain that everything cost exactly what the man who held it decided it cost, lay in a stranger's furs, and could not, for the life of her, make the plain words mean what they plainly said. The cabin was one room set back against the living rock of the cliff, a stone chimney and a low fire, one shuttered window, a heavy plank door, a rope-strung bunk, a plank table worn smooth, 2 rounds of log for seats, a shelf of tins and twists of dried herb, and a lean-to off the back where a goat complained in the dark and a horse shifted its feet. On the one wall hung in an oiled row his traps. Over the door, on 2 wooden pegs, a lever-action rifle, cleaned and waiting, a powder horn, a possibles bag. And Della understood from the bone-deep order of the place, every tool in its one right spot, that this was a man who kept his dangerous things where his hand would fall on them in the pitch dark, and had stayed alive up here alone a long time by never letting a thing be out of its place. He did not, those first days, ask how a young woman came to be walking off a dead trail into a blizzard, and she kept bracing for the question that would be the lever, the price dressed up as concern, and it never came. Only much later did she understand he had read most of it already, off her good ruined town boots and her ink and acid-stained hands, and the way she flinched from a raised arm, and that he, of all men, had needed very little of it explained. When the early dark came down that first evening, Silas took a bedroll and a wolf robe down off the wall and carried them toward the lean-to bed down with the animals in the cold, and over his shoulder, flat as a man reporting the depth of the snow, he said the thing that began, against every wall she had built up in 22 years, to take her apart. I won't touch you. The door bar's from the inside. There's the bar, leaning by the jamb. Drop it across if it sits easier in you. And he pulled the door to behind him and left a woman who 8 days before, a whole camp had marched up a street as a thief alone, in a warm room with food she had not paid for, and a heavy oak bar she was welcome to drop against him. Della did not sleep at first. She lay listening for the catch of it, the moment the latch would be tried from the other side, the price come due in the dark. It did not come. And after a long while, when the heat had finally reached her bones and her pride could no longer hold it off, she got up on her ruined feet and dropped the bar, not against him, she told herself, but because the dropping of it was a thing she could choose, one small coin of control on the far side of a winter that had taken everything else. And the last thing she thought before the dark pulled her under was that this silent man unsettled her worse than Doran Skeel ever had. Because Skeel she had understood in a single look, and this one she could not get the measure of. In the gray of the next morning she told him the bones of it, braced to be laughed at, because a disgraced woman's claim that she was framed is the lightest thing there is. She told him she had kept the assay office at Quartzfall, caught the claims recorder salting ore to swindle Eastern men, signed the truth and refused the money to unsign it, and that they had whispered her into a thief and drummed her out and fired the bridge behind her to let the mountain do the killing. The law would not. She waited to be disbelieved. Silas Renner listened without one word, feeding the fire, and when she had finished he said a thing better than comfort. 2 winters now. The talk down at the lower camps is run that Quartzfall struck rich, and the assays prove it. And I've packed enough green hides past that thin tea-colored creek to know there's no 200-ounce silver in that whole sorry gulch, nor ever was. His pale eyes were steady on her. A man who salts rock to sell a mountain that isn't there can't afford one honest furnace standing in his camp, any more than a card cheat can afford a bright lamp. I believe you. He set a stick on the coals, and a man who'd burn a bridge to let the cold kill a woman, rather than do it himself, won't be able to leave it to the cold in the end. A witness who's only most likely dead is no good to him with banknotes riding on it. He'll need to be sure of you before the pass opens in the spring and you walk down to a real court. You didn't get away from that man by living. You only moved the reckoning to the thaw. And Della, who had braced to be doubted or pitied, found herself instead believed and warned, and did not know which unstrung her more. If you've made it this far into Dell's story, hit subscribe. because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. She learned the shape of his silence over the days that followed, and learned it was not an empty thing but a full one, the way a sound seam of rock is full. He rose before the light and ran his trap lines up the frozen draws, came back and skinned and fleshed in the blue cold of the evenings, the cabin filling with the green raw smell of hides and the tallow smell of the rendering pot. He spoke to her almost only in instruction, never a wasted word. The spring out back for drinking, not the creek, because the creek would gripe her insides. If anything comes into this yard on 2 legs or 4, you get behind the bar and you stay there, and you do not come out for any voice, not even mine. Never a word that could be mistaken for tenderness, and yet under every flat instruction the same buried thing, here is how you stay alive. It ought to have comforted her, and instead it made her wild, because his refusal to name a price, his refusal even to be thanked, was itself a kind of debt to a woman built the way Della was built, a debt that compounded like a store account she had no way to pay down. And a debt you cannot discharge is a hand at the throat to a person who has spent her whole life keeping fair books. On the 4th morning she could not bear it an hour longer. She rose before he did, and built up the fire and swept the floor, and had water hot by the time he came in, stamping the cold off his boots, and stood up straight, chin high, and said in the hard, flat voice she had rehearsed all night, "I'll earn my keep. I'm not a beggar, and I will not be kept like one, and I will not lie in any man's debt. Tell me what work pays for the food and the fire, and the trouble of digging me out of a snowbank, and I will do it, every hour of it, until we are square." She had meant it to come out like iron. It came out closer to pleading, and they both heard it land that way. Silas looked at her a long moment, the scar standing pale through his brow in the firelight, and what he said was so low she nearly lost it under the crackle of the stove. "Stop trying to pay me back." He set down the brace of marten he was carrying. "There's no bill. I didn't haul you out of the snow to write you a kinder paper than that camp did. You start keeping a ledger on a thing like staying alive, it never comes square, and you'll spend whatever time you've got, left cold on the inside trying to balance it. If you want to work because the work needs doing, and there's 2 mouths now where there was one, then work, and welcome, but not to pay me. That I will not take off you." And Della, who had spent her whole life believing everything came at a price set by someone stronger, turned to the stove so he would not see her face, and understood that the largest thing anyone had ever done for her had been handed over with no price on it, free, a thing she would have to learn to carry instead of repay. "Then I'll work because it needs doing," she said to the iron of the stove. And she did. What her hands could not do at first, she learned one ruined thing at a time. Her assayer's hands were already hard, strong in the fingers from a lifetime of crucibles and tongs, and a balance beam that punished the smallest clumsiness, but the work up here found new places to break her. She scalded her wrist on the rendering kettle and laid her thumb open, learning the long, curved skinning knife. When she cut herself, Silas washed it with raw spirit that made her hiss and said only, "The blade works toward the bone, not toward your hand. Turn it." On the 8th day she split a whole rick of stovewood without weeping once, and by the end of the 2nd week she caught herself one evening turning her own scarred, acid-stained hands over in the firelight with a fierce, ugly pride she had no word for. And clear across the cabin she felt him notice it, and neither of them said a thing. She learned the hard iron economy of the place by getting it wrong and being let to. You set a trap so it took the animal quick and clean and not slow, because Silas would not abide a slow death, even in the creatures he killed to live. And that one fact told her more about the man than any confession could have. On the 14th morning, he put the skinning knife in her hand and stepped back, and she sank the first cut too deep and ruined a strip of prime fur worth money, and braced for him to snatch the knife back. He did not. Again, he said, and turned a second carcass toward her. And by the fourth, her hands had found the clean, even peeling pull that lifts a hide-off whole. And she looked up, and he had already gone back to his own work, which was the only praise the man owned and the truest she had ever been paid. And she found the old trade was still in her hands, and worth coin up here too. That a woman whose fingers know how to true a balance and read a fine bead has a feel for small exact work the mountain can use. She fixed a sprung trap he'd thought ruined, filed a true edge onto his knife and axe, and when he watched her retrue the bent beam of an old pocket scale he kept for his trade gold, he grunted, which she had learned to read as astonishment, and said, "Keep those hands. Don't let this country make you forget they knew a finer trade before it taught them this one." And that somehow undid her worse than any kindness would have. The weeks bled one into another, measured out by the shrinking stack of stovewood and the growing stack of cured pelts and a snow line that no longer dropped because there was nowhere lower for it to fall. The pass above filled and sealed. The burned bridge and the camp below sank under the snow as though they'd never been. The world narrowed to one warm room and a cliff at its back and a stretch of white meadow before the door. And somewhere in the brutal arithmetic of staying alive next to him, Della stopped flinching when he came through the door, and Silas stopped carrying his rifle to the lean-to at night. And two people who had each long ago decided to die alone began, without ever saying a word about it, to do their living next to someone else. She kept a sharpened skinning knife by the bunk the first weeks. Then one morning she noticed she had not thought of it in days, and didn't put it back. The high country had its own scattered people in it, thin as the smoke. An old man wintered alone in a half-fallen cabin down the next drainage, a broken-down former camp doctor named Amos Hollis, who had doctored the diggings when they were young and been used up and forgotten by them, gone half-blind and lung-sick and poor. And Silas looked in on him every week or so with a haunch of meat and an hour of his silence, because the old man had set Silas's broken arm once, years back, and asked nothing for it. And Silas Renner did not forget a kindness no more than he'd charge for one. The fever came for the old man in the dead of winter, on the worst possible night, as they always do. Silas came back from his weekly look-in moving fast, and told her in 4 flat sentences that Hollis was down with the lung fever, burning hot and dragging at the air with a thin wet rattle deep in his chest, alone in a cold cabin with his fire gone to gray coals, and that a man that old and that far gone in the lungs did not last such a thing by himself. Bank our stove down and bring the eucalyptus off the shelf, and the yarrow and the willow bark, he said, and put on every stitch you own. We're going down there, and we are not coming back up until he breathes easy, or he doesn't. And Della, who 8 weeks before had been marched up a street and put out to freeze by men who would not cross a room to save her, put on every stitch she owned and went out into the killing dark to fight for the breath of an old stranger, and did not think until much later how far she had already climbed from the woman in the drift. They broke through the drifts to the old doctor's cabin and found him worse than even Silas had feared, blue at the lips and barely pulling the air. And the silent trapper became, for one long night, a man who knew exactly what to do with his hands. And Della understood she was watching him fight a thing he had fought once before and lost. They built the fire up past all economy and made a tent of a wool blanket over 2 chairs and the table. And into a kettle off the boil, Silas crushed a dark, twisted leaf traded up the mountain off a coast ship eucalyptus with pine pitch and dried yarrow, until the tent filled with a sharp medicinal steam that pried the closed airway open. And the strange grace of that night was this, that the old man, even burning, even half blind, was still a doctor down in his bones, and between the coughing fits he rasped out what to do. How cool to wring the cloths so the chill would pull the fever without shocking the old heart. How much willow bark tea was medicine, and how much too much. So Della sat in that hot, wet dark with him propped against her shoulder, hour upon hour, her assayer's strong arms holding the frail weight of him up so his chest would not fill, her quick, exact hands doing the fine work his blind ones could no longer do, dosing by his whispered count, a half-blind healer teaching an assayer to be his hands in the dark. When the fever spiked, they wrapped him in cloths wrung out in snowmelt, and he cursed them feebly for the cold, and Silas said low, "The cursing's good. Cursing, he's breathing. It's the quiet you fight." And past the middle of the night the fever broke at last. The rattle loosened, and the old man slept, truly slept, and Della sat in the thinning steam with her arms gone dead from the holding, and wept once, from something that was not grief. It was in that blackest, warmest stretch of the night, with the old doctor breathing easy at last, that the silence in Silas Renner finally cracked open, and the man began to talk. He had a wife once, he told the dark, not looking at her. His voice a low rumble. She felt through the cabin wall more than heard, in the years after the war. They had a place down in a low valley, and one hard winter she took the lung fever the same as the old man yonder had, and Silas rode 2 days through the snow to fetch a doctor, and the doctor would not come, because Silas had no money to lay down and reckoned a poor trapper's wife not worth the bad road. "I rode back alone," Silas said, "and I did everything I knew how, which was nothing, because I didn't know to open the air or cool the fever. I just held her and watched her drown in her own chest over 4 days. And there wasn't one soul on God's earth to teach me what these old blind hands taught you tonight." The fire ticked in the stove. Amos Hollis set my arm the year after, in a camp where every man had a price on every kindness, and he never sent me a bill for it. So when his lungs went tonight, I was not going to ride back home alone a second time. Not for him. Not for anybody. Ever again. While I've got 2 hands and a kettle and the herbs to do it. And Della understood all at once the whole shape of the man, that the silence she had taken for coldness was a grief 11 winters deep, and that he was still, after all those years, riding back through the snow trying to reach someone in time. And then, with the dawn just beginning to gray, the cracks in the shutter, and a saved old man asleep across the room, Silas said the rest of it, the part that detonated the whole winter, quietly, the way he did everything. "When I dug you out of that drift, it wasn't kindness. I was 11 winters too late to dig my own wife out of hers. And there you were, somebody the cold had thrown away the same as it threw away her. And for once in my life, I was on time. That's all it was. So hear this once, clear and carry it no further. Hauling you out of that snow bought me nothing. There's no debt between you and me, and never will be one you didn't write yourself. The day that pass clears, you're free to walk down it and go anywhere, owing me not a grain, and I'll grubstake you to the district seat and call it a good winter's work. I didn't carry you up here to keep you. I did it because I once rode back alone to a woman the world would not lift a finger to save, and swore over her I'd never again let the cold have one more soul it had no right to, not while I had the hands to stop it." He looked at her across the sleeping old man. "You're not bought. You're not kept, and you're free." And Della lay against the warm cabin wall, and understood that the chain she had braced half a winter to feel draw tight had never been forged, and that the thing growing in that one warm room was the kind she had never been offered, the kind with no bill at the end of it. And it frightened her worse than the fever, worse than Skeel, worse than the cold, because a debt she knew how to live under, and this she did not. The old doctor lived. By the second morning the rattle had loosened, and by the third he was sitting up demanding to be told whether anyone had thought to milk the goat, which Silas pronounced the surest sign of mending he knew. And 2 nights after, back in their own cabin with the storm walling them in white, Della did the only thing left that could answer what the man had given her, which was to trade him truth for truth. She told him all of it, the smelter town and the careful husband, and the weak heart that stopped over the balance, the salted sample and the number she would not unsign. And when she had finished, she lifted the small worn brass assay weight off the thong at her throat, set it on the plank table between them, and said, "That's the whole of what I am. A widow who weighed a thing true when a powerful man needed it, weighed false, and got drummed out as a thief for it." And Silas looked at the little brass weight a long moment, then said, "Lo, your mother kept the books beside your father her whole life, and put that weight in your hand instead of a dowry, because she knew what your eye was worth, and it was never on anybody's ledger. You caught a rich man salting the rock to rob men who'd never climb up to see it, and instead of taking the money he offered you to look the other way, which is what 9 in 10 would have done and called it good sense, you wrote it down true and would not unwrite it. They put you out to freeze for the crime of weighing honest. That's the most stubborn, honest thing I ever dug out of a snowbank." And Della understood, closing her fist around the brass weight, that the thing the world had tried to bury her for had a different name up here, worth more than all the gold Skeel had ever filed into barren rock. But buried things have a way of working back to the surface, and the man who had counted on the snow to keep his secret could not, in the end, leave the burying to the mountain. Down below, in the gray weeks of late winter, Doran Skeel's clean plan had developed a crack he could not stop probing like a sore tooth. The salted samples had gone east, the eastern money had come back, and now men with that money behind them talked of sending an expert out. Come spring and worse, the district seat had got wind that the camp's assays did not match the rock the freighters hauled down, and the territorial mining recorder meant to ride over the pass with the thaw to examine the claims and the certificates both. And for all of that, Skeel needed the one person alive who could stand before a real recorder and prove his rock was salt to be, beyond any question, dead. He had assumed she was. But a hard, small thing nagged at him the way guilt nags a careful man, that no one had ever found a body. And then a leering old camp packer named Tuck, who missed nothing in the gulches, carried him a thing for a bottle that the silent hermit up the high north draws had laid in at the far trading post, twice the flour and powder a single man winters on. And the talk was he'd taken in some stray off the mountain in the first storm. A stray, off the mountain, in the first storm. And Skeel went cold and still behind his pleasant face and understood that his witness was alive and warm with the one man in the country who could not be bought nor frightened. And that come the thaw, she would walk straight into the path of a territorial recorder with everything she had assayed and seen. That was the thing Doran Skeel could not bear. And he went to work that week to do by paper what the mountain had failed to do by cold, and his haste was nearly the death of them all. He could not simply ride up and shoot her. A hermit trapper and a banished woman found shot would bring down exactly the territorial law he had spent 2 years keeping over the far side of the pass. So he reached for the oldest tool a guilty man with the law in his pocket owns, which is to make his victim the criminal, The committee's writ ran only to the edge of camp, so Skeel found a soft, greedy man named Pruitt, who had let a county deputy's commission lapse, and over a bottle they manufactured a fraud stacked on a fraud. A sworn warrant charging that the gold Della was said to have stolen made her a thief and a fugitive, authorizing the bearer to retake her wherever found and naming any man who sheltered her an accomplice. A perfect inversion. The honest assayer became the thief, the salter of ore became the law, and the warrant gave Skeel the legal-seeming right to ride up that mountain with armed men, take the one mouth that could undo him, and call the taking of her justice. And in the last hard weeks of winter, in a false thaw that crusted the deep snow just firm enough to bear a horse, Dorr and Skeel came up the high north trail behind a code of law and the courage of numbers. Pruitt with his lapsed commission to read the warrant lawful, and 4 hard men in heavy dusters with lever-action rifles behind, paid in coin to bring a woman down off a mountain and not ask why. And if the trapper would not give her up, well, a warrant is a wonderful thing for making a killing look like an arrest, and a fugitive thief shot resisting capture audits no man's books. Silas saw them coming. He had cut their sign that morning on the lower trail, 6 horses where no horses had any business being, and came back fast and quiet, and laid it out for her in 4 flat sentences, and Della felt the old cast-out terror rise up and run straight into something new the winter had built in her, and the new thing won. She did not freeze. "How long?" she said. "An hour, maybe less," he said, already taking the rifle down off the pegs. "They'll come up the open meadow because there's no other way to bring horses up. The deputy reads his paper first to make it lawful, and if we don't fold to it, they'll do it the other way. I can put you up into the rocks above the cliff where they'll never find you, and hold the door alone. That's the smart play. And I'll do it, if you say the word." And Della looked at the man who had pulled her out of a snowbank and refused to own her, and heard her mother's voice clear as the fire, that the only thing in this world that holds is the thing you make true with your own 2 hands. "No," she said, "I have spent this entire winter being the thing other men decided I was. An honest woman they could call a thief, a witness they could leave to the cold, a fugitive now because it suits a swindler to swear I am one. I have got one thing now that's mine. You are not holding that door alone." And he looked at her one long moment and then did the thing that told her everything they had become across one hard winter. He did not argue and did not send her up into the rocks. He took the old single shot down from over the bunk and set it beside the lever action. "Then we'd best be quick. You've handled the rifle out at the woodpile all winter and never knew I was teaching you. Now I'm telling you." And in the little time they had, he taught her the last of it, the slow breathing and the slow steady squeeze, and the way you do not fight the kick, but let it come back through you, and to make every shot a true one, because they had powder enough for a fight, but not for a careless one. She set herself a place at the shuttered window and laid the spare cartridges out in a row on the sill where her hand would find them in the dark, every brass case squared exactly to the next, because an assayer's hands know better than any how much can hang on a thing being laid out true and ready before the work begins. And she pressed her mother's small brass weight to her lips once, warm from her own throat, and took up her place at the window. And she noticed it with a kind of wonder even then, in the worst hour of her life, that her hands were not shaking anymore. They came up the meadow just as Silas had said, 6 riders strung across the crusted snow in the hard, flat light, and stopped out of easy range, and Pruitt stood in his stirrups and read the warrant out in a thin official whine, every word lawful sounding and every word bought. declaring Della Forsythe a fugitive thief who had robbed the assay office and fled arrest, ordering Renner to give her up or stand as her accomplice. And Silas opened the cabin door and stood in it, filling it, the rifle loose and ready. Let the deputy finish and said, in a voice that did not need raising and carried across that meadow like a dropped axe, "There's no thief here. There's a woman who kept that assay office honest and caught your claims recorder yonder salting barren rock with filed gold to sell a mountain that isn't there to men back east, who'll never climb up to see they've been robbed. That's why a thin gulch that never ran 2 ounces is papered as the richest strike in the territory. She signed the truth and would not unsign it, so he whispered her into a thief, and your committee voted her out and burned the bridge to let the cold finish her quiet. And when it didn't, he had this man swear out a paper calling the only honest witness in camp the robber, so he could ride up here lawful and bury her before the recorder comes over the pass with the thaw. Ask yourselves why a rich man rides up a mountain in a false thaw. To kill a woman over a little office gold, he could let lie. He's not here for a thief. He's here for the one furnace that can prove his rock is salt. And there's a recorder coming up this same trail behind you with the spring. And he let it sit. And Della watched from the loophole as the 4 hired men traded a long look. Because there is a world of difference in a hired man's mind between hauling in a lawful fugitive for a bounty and gunning down a woman to cover salted ore. And Silas had just moved the whole business from the first into the second in front of their eyes. It was Doran Skeel who could not let it sit, because a guilty man with the law in his pocket cannot bear to be named out loud. And he pushed his horse forward and let the pleasantness fall out of his voice for the first time. She's a thief. The warrant's lawful and sworn, and any man here too soft for the work can ride down now and forfeit his pay, he said, and jerked his chin at the cabin door. Take them. And then Della ended it, and she did it not with the rifle but with her voice, because she had finally learned up on that mountain that her word wasn't worth nothing after all. She called out from the window, clear and carrying across the snow, to the 4 hired men and not to Skeel at all. He says I stole gold and salted ore. I am the assayer. Ask him to his face to show you one sample of Quartzfall rock that runs the way his certificates swear, assayed by any honest furnace but the one he burned. He can't, because there isn't one, because the gold in his rich rock was filed off a coin and fired in from a shotgun, and any assayer in the territory will tell you the same the day the recorder cracks a sample open. The strike he's selling east is a lie, and I'm the furnace that proved it, and that's why a rich man is freezing and forging and now hiring murder over a thin gulch. He's not afraid of me. He's afraid of the men coming up that trail behind you with the thaw, and means for you to do the killing that keeps his salted rock from ever being cracked open before a recorder. And you'll hang for it the same as he will. And she watched it land on the hired men like cold water flung in the face, watched them turn in their saddles to look hard at Skeel, at Pruitt, at the 2 fresh warrants in the deputy's fist, and one said, flat, I didn't sign on for a salted claim killing matter, and turned his horse, and then a second turned his, and the courage of numbers, the only courage Doran Skeel had ever been able to buy, came apart in the cold like everything else that winter. Pruitt, seeing his bought warrant named a fraud in front of witnesses and a territorial recorder invoked in the same breath, lost his nerve and reined back, stammering that he had only sworn out what the recorder told him to swear. And Doran Skeel, left of a sudden with 2 riders gone and a deputy backing away, and his borrowed authority bleeding out into the snow, made the last bad choice of the day. He clawed for the pistol under his good dark coat to do by force what the paper no longer could, swinging it up toward the big still shape filling the cabin doorway. And 2 things happened in the same half-second. Della, at the loophole, fired first, not at the man but at the thing in his hand, the way Silas had taught her at the woodpile all winter without her ever knowing she was being taught, and the heavy slug took the pistol spinning out of Skeel's fist and left him gripping a hand gone suddenly wrong, screaming, breathing, alive, because she had aimed to stop the thing and not to kill the man. And in the same breath, Silas came down off the step and started across the snow toward the man on the horse, unhurried, levering the next round home, closing the distance, and that broke Doran's Skeel entirely. The coward in him, the one that had always done its taking at a slant, from behind a claim and a committee vote, and a whispered word and a burned bridge, and a forged paper and other men's guns, looked at the scarred mountain of a man walking straight at him with no fear in him, and Skeel hauled his horse around and ran, the great recorder of Quartzfall running flat out down his own mountain, with nothing left of his authority but the knowledge that a forged warrant had just been named a forgery in front of witnesses who would talk. They didn't have to run him down, and that was the mercy and the justice of it both. The two hired men who had quit first, glad now to be witnesses on the right side of a fraud, carried it down the mountain and could not stop telling it. And when the pass opened, Silas took Della and old Amos Hollis the long road to the district seat, where the territorial mining recorder had come up with the thaw and the circuit court was sitting. Della stood before a real judge and recorder and told it plain, and then did the one thing no whisper in any saloon could ever undo. She asked them to do the very thing Skeel had spent a winter and a forged warrant and a hired murder trying to prevent. She asked them to crack his samples open and assay the rock themselves. And they did. The recorder sent men up to the Quartzfall claims and brought down ore from the face, and an honest furnace assayed it true, and it ran exactly the thin middling silver and almost no gold Della had sworn it ran, and every fabulous certificate Skeel had papered his swindle with was shown for a salted lie. The Eastern money was followed home, the burned bridge, the vigilance committee, the warrant sworn by a deputy with a lapsed commission, all of it laid bare. And Doran's Skeel, taken trying to buy passage east under another name with the last of the banknotes, was broken in open court, his 9 salted claims read out before the territory, his forged warrant named the men he had robbed, pointed at last to the man who robbed them. And Della walked out of that courthouse owing no man on earth a thing, a free woman by a real judge's word, her name struck clean, the trade she had been left to die for, vindicated to the last grain by the same furnace she had been put out to silence. But the courthouse was a long road and a whole season away, and the truest hour came earlier, up on the mountain the morning after the meadow, when the danger had drained out of the world and left it washed and blinding and still. Della stood in the open door of the cabin in the white dazzle, and Silas came and stood beside her, close enough that their arms touched, and neither of them moved away. And after a while she said the thing she had not been able to say for weeks, plainly, looking out at the snow and not at him. When the pass opens, I'm not going down it to stay. She turned the small brass weight once on its thong at her throat. You told me I was free to go anywhere in the world. This is where I want to go. And Silas was quiet a long moment, and then the man who had refused for one whole winter to make a sound that could be mistaken for tenderness reached over, slow, giving her every chance to pull away, and closed his big scarred hand around hers where it worried the little brass weight, and held it. And that was his whole answer, and it was enough. And the two of them watched the sun come up white and clean over the high peaks, with a saved old doctor snoring by the stove behind them. They did not marry that spring, though they would quietly, in their own time, down in the valley town, before the same judge, with old Amos Hollis come down out of the hills to stand up for them, and Della signed that paper, the only document that ever bore her name by her own free hand, and laughed once at the strangeness of setting her name to a thing on purpose, she who had spent a winter nearly killed by other men's papers. But the marrying was never the point. The point was the morning in the open door, and the choosing and the slow turning of two people who had each long ago decided to die alone, toward the difficult plain miracle of living on purpose next to someone else. They worked the high line together and took old Amos in when his eyes and lungs would no longer let him winter alone, and he lived out his days warm by their stove, telling the story of the night an assayer weighed his medicine out by his whispered count and held his old chest open against the dark, a story that grew taller every year. And on a nail by the cabin door, where another house might have hung a horseshoe, hung a small worn brass assay weight on a knotted leather thong, and the only paper kept anywhere in that house was a single sheet Della had signed herself, of her own free hand. And on the evenings when Silas was laid off the high line, Della Renner would step onto the porch and turn the little weight once with her thumb, the old habit, no longer a thing held against drowning, but only a thing held, and watch the tree line for the big scarred shape of him coming home. A woman who had stopped, somewhere across one hard winter, waiting for a man with a ledger and a vote to tell her what she was worth. A camp's good opinion is the coldest cage a frontier ever built, because the cruelty does its quiet work in a whispered word and a show of hands in the back of a warm saloon, and lets the man who counts the votes call himself the law and the camp's conscience both, while the killing is done by a mountain that never gets named at the trial. Doran Skeel spent 2 years learning to salt barren rock and sell a mountain that was not there, and one false thaw learning that the cleanest murder of all is the one where you never lift your own hand. What he did not count on is that the same cold he meant to use against her is also the thing that strips two thrown-away people down to what they are truly made of, and that sometimes what they are made of, under the fear and the years of keeping their heads down, is the kind of stubborn, unkillable honesty that weighs a thing true, when weighing it false would have been so much warmer, and that stands in a doorway with a rifle. And will not let a powerful liar have one more soul he has no right to take. So here is what I'll leave you with, and I'd honestly like to know, because I read every one of these. Della Forsythe believed most of her life that a woman with no money and no name was only ever worth what the men who held the books and counted the votes decided to write beside her. It took a silent man who dug her out of a snowbank and asked for nothing to teach her that there is always one more door, the one you climb toward, even when the climb might kill you, and that the moment that saved her was the one she stopped waiting to be rescued and named the liar out loud, in the snow, with a Winchester in her hands. So tell me, honest, down in the comments, if a whole town had voted you out into a blizzard to let the cold do its killing for it, and then come up the mountain with a forged paper to finish what the snow could not, do you think you'd have gone down quiet, the way the world spends so many lives teaching us to? Or do you think you'd have stood in that doorway beside the one person who tore up the paper that owned you? Tell me which one you think you've got in you. And so the lamp goes dim in the high cabin while the snow keeps falling. Stay warm, stay a while, and tell me in the comments, would you have stayed inside or grabbed the Winchester?